So, welcome, Julian. Hi.
Thank you. Thanks.
Okay, so this week's Parsha is, of course, about the big showdown between Yaakov and Esav. Yaakov has been on the run for several decades from his brother. He was in Haran, hanging out with, I'm just going to mute everybody, and you can unmute yourself as needed. He was in Haran hanging out with his father-in-law and then his wives and children for 20 years. 7 years working for Rivka, for Rachel. Then, of course, he was tricked into marrying Leah. 7 years for marrying Rachel again. And then 6 years to make some sheep. And then he is on the way back. And by the way, he also stopped on the way there for 14 years to study yeshiva. So he's really been away for 34 years. And he's hoping that Esav kind of is not going to make a big deal about him coming back. And he will, okay, hold on, I have to move to another room, excuse me. Oh yeah, the one that I took out, I finished, yeah. Okay, there we go. Sorry about that. So, Yaakov was kind of hoping that Esav would have forgotten about his taking the brachas, the blessings, disguising himself as Esav, which he was really entitled to the brachas, as we know, because he had already bought the firstborn rights from Esav. Nevertheless, Esav had not forgotten, and according to Yaakov's intelligence, he sent angels, and they returned and said Esav was on his way with 400 men. Obviously, this is not a peaceful mission. You don't need 400 men to come greet your brother. Obviously, he was still mad, and he was planning to take revenge. So, as we read in the Parsha, Yaakov sent gifts to Esav to try to soften him up. He prepared for a battle in case there would have to be a battle, and he also prayed. And on the way there, he met up with Esav's angel. They wrestled. Yaakov was injured, but nevertheless he prevailed. And the angel told him that he owned the blessings by right. And then finally they meet up, the two brothers, and instead of trying to kill him, lo and behold, Esav hugs Yaakov, kisses him, and they seem to be the best of friends. And they ask about each other's wives, family, and Esav even offers to escort Yaakov, to send his men to escort him back. And Yaakov says, no, the kids are small, and there's a lot of sheep, and you don't have to bother with that. And Esav returns on that day back to Seir. That's the land where he lived at that time. And Yaakov goes to a different location, Sukkos it's called, and hangs out there for another year and a half before finally coming back to the land of Israel. And that's when there's unfortunately more trouble with the city of Shechem. Dinah is abducted, and only later does he come back to his father after his wife Rachel passes away, unfortunately. So a lot going on in this parsha. Not all of it is happy, but at least Esav does not attempt to harm Yaakov. So let's read verse 16 in chapter 33, where it says, Vayashav bayomahu Esav ledarkoi seira. Esav returned on that day on his way to Seir. Now Rashi says, Esav levadoi. Esav returned alone. Vidalid meos ish shaholchu imoi. Whereas the 400 men that went with him, nishmetu me'etzloi echad echad. Welcome, Mr. Smith. Nishmetu me'etzloi echad echad. They slipped away from him one at a time. Ve'echen parlam HaKadosh Baruch Hu, where did Hashem pay them back? He made David in the days of David. Shenemar, as it says, Ki im arba me'es ish nar sherochu ala gemalim, except for 400 men who were riding on camels. Okay, so basically the verse says that Esav returned on his way to Seir, and it doesn't mention that he had the 400 men with him. What happened to those 400 men? So Rashi says they slipped away one at a time. They did not hang around with him. This was considered a good deed on their part because they were Esav's support in his original wish to harm Yaakov, and they backed away from that, and they each went on their way, and therefore there was a reward coming to them, and that reward came many centuries later. That reward came in a story that happened with David and his men. I'll give you a bit of background to that story before we read the verse inside. So everybody knows that King David started off as a shepherd, and he was also a musician, and he would play for King Saul. King Saul had bouts of melancholy because he had been told by the prophet that the kingship was going to be taken from him. So he would get these bouts of depression, and his servants found a young shepherd boy who knew how to play music, and that was none other than David, the son of Yishai, son of Jesse. And he would come and he would play. Anyway, he was the youngest of 8 brothers, and the Philistines were starting up a war against the Jews. And they had the big giant Goliath who would come out every morning and challenge the Jews to a duel and say whoever wins the duel will be the master over the other nation. There's no need to make a whole fight between the two armies. And of course, as the story goes, all the men were afraid to fight Goliath. And King David came to deliver some goods to his brothers who were in the army. He wasn't in the army, he was a young shepherd. And when he heard Goliath's challenge, he just couldn't handle the disgrace that he spoke so in a blasphemous way about the Jewish God and the Jewish people. And he said, nobody's going to fight this guy. What's going on? And he said, I'll do it. And people laughed at him. How are you going to fight him? You're not used to wars. The king offered him his own armor. And King David, even though it fit him, even though he was much shorter than King Saul, he said, no, I don't want the armor. It's not my style. And he chose 5 stones from the river. And he went with his bag, this shepherd bag, to meet the big giant. And as everybody knows, after a little back and forth dialogue, he felled him with a stone that went through the hole in his visor, fell on the floor. King David took out Goliath's sword, killed him. And he was supposed to marry King Saul's daughter. And there was a bit of issue. King Saul didn't really want to give him his daughter because he was getting jealous of David. David was so successful in battle, more successful than he, more popular than he. There was a rumor out that King David had been anointed as the next king. King Saul was jealous. In the end, he did give him his daughter, but then the jealousy got the better of him and he tried to kill him on several occasions. And finally, King David had no choice but to run away. At first, he came back, but then the king tried to kill him again. He had no choice but to run away. And he spent the rest of King Saul's life running away from him. And it was always like a game of cat and mouse. The local inhabitants would inevitably tell the king about David's location, and the king would come with his army, and King David would always escape, sometimes in miraculous ways. Finally, having no choice, David, who had already collected men to be on his side, 600 men, decided he was going to defect from the country, and he moved to the land of the Philistines. Now, the Philistines were Saul's enemies, and therefore David figured they would be a good host for him. And that's where he hung out for a few months. Now, what David would do is he would take his band and he would raid nearby villages, non-Jewish villages, and he would wipe them out, leave no survivors. And he was doing this because these were the enemies of the Jews, and he wanted to make the Jews, the land, safe. And the Philistines never realized he was doing it because there was no survivors to tell the story. One time, when he came back after one of these raids, his own camp had been raided. The Amalekites, who are descendants of Esav from his oldest son Eliphaz, had raided his camp, had taken the wives and children as hostages, and had taken all of their stuff with them, leaving nothing behind. Now, King David's men were super upset, you can imagine, that their families were taken. And they were so upset they wanted to actually stone David because they considered him to be at fault since he was their leader. And David strengthened himself in his belief in Hashem, and he consulted with the Kohen who was with him, who had the Urim B'Tumim, the breastplate, where you can ask God what to do. And God said they should fight. They should follow this tribe and fight. So they traveled as quickly as they could. Some of the men, it was too much for them, and they stayed on one side of the river. 200 of them stayed behind. But he and 400 men continued chasing the Amalekites. On the way, they came across a slave, an Egyptian slave, who was sick and famished. He hadn't eaten in 3 days and 3 nights. And they asked him who he was, and he said he was an Egyptian slave, and he belonged to the Amalekites. But because he was sick, they had left him behind. And here he was. So they said to him, "Can you tell us where their camp is?" And he said, "Yes, I'll tell you where the camp is on condition that you promise not to kill me and not to give me back to my master." So they agreed to that, which goes to show you have to treat everybody nicely, even the slaves or whatever, the people who you consider lower class. You never know what they could do. Yes, I will try to talk louder. And they came across the Amalekite camp. The Amalekites were feasting. and partying. And they were not even protecting their own camp with guards because they were so into just the loot that they had taken. And they were taken by surprise. All the women and children were intact. None of them had been killed. And David and his men completely obliterated their entire camp, with the exception of 400 men. And here is where we read verse 17 of chapter 30 in the first book of Samuel. Vayakim David mehaneshef va'ad ha'erev lemacharasam v'lo nimlat mehen ish ki im arba meis ish nar asher rochvu al hagmalim vayanusu. David attacked them from before dawn until the evening of the next day. None of them escaped, except 400 young men who mounted camels and got away. So those 400 men, the fact that they were able to escape and they were not wiped out by David and his men, that was considered to be a payback for the 400 men who were originally on Esau's side, and they slipped away as he returned home, as we mentioned. Okay, so the Rebbe discusses why Rashi feels the need to explain this whole background story. Like, what forces us to say that the 400 men slipped away? The very fact that it says Esau returned on that day to Seir, and it doesn't say that the 400 men returned, that is not a proof that they didn't return, because the verse leaves some information out, because it expects us to understand it ourselves. It doesn't always spell things out. I'll give you an example. In this very parsha, right after this verse, it says, V'Yaakov nosa Sukkoisa. Jacob traveled to Sukkos. It doesn't say that he took his wives and children with him. Well, of course he did, because he was with them. So what, he left them behind? Of course he traveled with them. It goes without saying. So if Esau was with 400 men and he returned back to Seir, why not just say that he went back with his men, rather than say that he went back and they escaped and slipped away and so on? And even if Rashi finds that necessary to say, why does he add that information about the 400 men who escaped on camels and that was payback? Rashi, his job is not to teach us Tanakh and to tell us nice stories and tidbits of information. Rashi is here to share with us the pshat, the understanding of the verse. So if we understand the verse, that should be fine. Did God pay those men back? Okay, maybe he did, maybe he didn't. We assume he did, because God always pays somebody back for the good deeds that they do. But do we have to know the payback for every good deed that is recorded in the Torah? Well, why does Rashi find it important for us to know exactly how these 400 men were paid back? In general, it's a difficult thing to understand how a person gets paid back by his descendants getting something, rather than the person themselves getting something. These 400 men were dead and buried many centuries before their descendants were saved. So how does that work, that you pay somebody back by doing a favor, or that God pays somebody back by doing a favor for their descendants? So these are all questions that the Lubavitcher Rebbe asks. But before I continue, I'll open it up for any questions or comments. that you'd like to share, because I can't talk for too long at a time. I mean, I can, but I shouldn't.
Can I ask one more question, please?
Yes, of course.
Can you give us a few more examples, or at least one if you have, of a situation similar to that? And this is number one. Number two, is
Situation
it
similar to what?
usually a
One second.
to
Situation similar
what
to
we
what?
see as the 400 people who were present with Esau when he came to see Yaakov, and then we had 400 men from Amalek's camp that escaped. Is it just coincidence, or it has a connection? That's why my first question. I understand that that's what is explained by Rabbi. But the second one, is it usually just bad deeds that are kind of punished in the next generation sometimes? Or it's a good things that are, people in next generations receive some, some praise or some, benefits of it?
Okay, both of those are fair questions. In terms of the connection between these 400 men and those 400 men, Rashi draws that connection. It's not explicit in the verse. I wouldn't be surprised if Rashi gets it from a medrash. That's kind of the go-to source that we have for these kind of connections. But in terms of slipping away, actually, there is a parallel. Sorry, there is another story where there's a group of people that slip away. Who knows? When Moshe came to the Jewish people and said that that God sent him to take them out of exile, and now come with me to Pharaoh, and we're going to present our case. They all said, yeah, we're going to go. And him and Aaron went at the head of this whole delegation. And by the time they came to Pharaoh's palace, it was just him and Aaron, because all the others chickened out. They were afraid to confront the authority. And in the end, they did not remain as the leaders of the Jewish people for a very long time. There was a new set of leaders appointed in only the second year of the desert. So they kept their position for another year or so, but they were evidently not, of the caliber to be the long-term leaders, so it seems. In terms of reward and punishment for the next generation, yes, we do find that both reward and punishment can be passed on to the next generation. We find that in the Torah portion of Va'et Hanan and one more portion. I think it's in Kitisa, where it says Notzer Chesed La'alafim, and it also says Poked Avon Avot Al Banim Va'al Bnei Banim Al Shileshim Va'al Ribeim, that God remembers kindness for 2,000 generations. That means that he can repay a person by paying back his descendants up to 2,000 generations. When it comes to punishment, that goes for sons, grandsons, 3 and 4 generations. So it only goes up to 4 generations, not more than that. And even that, the Talmud says, only applies to descendants who follow in the wicked path of their ancestors. If they break away and behave differently, then they can, then they would not get punished. because God does not visit the sins of the parents on the children unless the children are following in the wicked ways of their parents. Questions? Any other questions?
Yes, Rabbi, I have.
Yes.
Penina Sarah.
Hi.
I tell you, I am very fit to be tied. I am so miserable because this these deaths of these hostages. I don't know if it's not confirmed, perhaps, but the little babies, Kfir Bibas and his brother, the 4-year-old, and the mother, they're now saying that is that Hamas says that at first they said they gave them to Islamic Jihad, and they said that they were killed by an Israeli strike, which is, God knows if that's true or not. The thing is, I'm really very inconsolable over this. It just seems so horrible. They went through so much, they suffered so hard, and I mean, and they were in such terror when the mother was when they were taken, and I mean, with all the praying and all the begging of the Hashem and the Psalms and everything, the Tehillim, and yet this is what happens. I mean, if in fact it's true, which I don't know, but I'm just really, I don't know which way to turn. I mean, it seems like we're facing, tomorrow's the last day. These globalist organizations are passing these draconian laws that are going to make this legislation very hard on us. And the administration's not doing anything. They're not doing anything in Israel, although many people are fighting, but the governments don't listen. And I'm really very disconsolate, very disheartened.
I don't have any answers. The situation there is very difficult. It has been very difficult. I will say that there's no question that prayers are listened to, and God does answer them. Doesn't always answer them in the way we would like them answered, and in a way that we can understand clearly and draw the line and understand how they're answered. But the prayers are answered. If you remember, there was an Israeli hostage who was found alive in Gaza, Noah, going back a few weeks. And that was just after, that was literally the morning after her mother had participated in a challah bake, and they were doing a Sefer Torah dedication in her honor. They brought it to her bedroom. And then the next day she was found. So there was like a very clear line. And people are certainly praying around the world for the hostages and for the soldiers. And I can't tell you which prayers are helping for whom and all of that. That's obviously God's department. So why some are returned, some are still hostages, some unfortunately seem to have been killed. These are questions for the higher authority, not for me. But we should not be disheartened, because we have to pray. That's what we can do to participate and to help. Okay.
We ourselves are still facing this thing with these globalists. They're really going to try to impose a dictatorship upon us, very severe.
I'm more worried about the soldiers in Gaza than about the globalists. Hashem will save us. Don't worry.
Bezrat Hashem.
Okay. Welcome, Naomi. Okay. So, to answer the question that we were mentioning earlier about how Rashi knows that these 400 men slipped away one at a time, rather than saying that they are not mentioned explicitly, but they presumably went back with Esav. So the idea is that at no point do we find anywhere in the verse an indication that Esav actually lost his deep-seated enmity towards Yaakov. All we find is that they hugged and kissed at that time. And Rashi says on that meeting, about that meeting, Rashi says two interpretations. One was that it was not a kiss that he did with his whole heart. It was a half-hearted kiss, half-hearted hug. Another interpretation is no, that even though it's a halacha, meaning to say it's an established fact that Esav hates Yaakov, nevertheless, at this moment, he was inspired to have love for him, and he did kiss him with his whole heart. Nevertheless, both agree that this was only a temporary change. What exactly brought it about? Well, Yaakov had been praying, and he had been sending gifts. There may have also been a little bit of a fear factor involved, because Rashi brings the Medrash that says that on the way there were angels who actually accosted Esav and his men, and the angels were beating them. And when they said, "Leave us alone, we're with Esav," the angels continued to beat them. When they said, "Esav is the son of Yitzchok, leave us alone," angels kept on beating them. Esav is the grandson of Avraham, the angels continued beating them. Finally, when they said, "Well, Esav is Yaakov's brother," at that point the angels stopped beating them. And then Yaakov also informed Esav that he had fought with his angel and been successful in that battle. So there was that factor as well. But whatever it was only a temporary reprieve. There was no deep-seated change of heart. And that's the real reason that when Esav offered to have his men escort Yaakov back to Israel, back to where his destination was, Yitzchok, and so on, Beersheba, Yaakov said, "No, it's okay. We have young children, like I mentioned earlier, sheep and whatever." He refused to take those escorts because he knew that nothing really changed in any meaningful way. And to have those men who were really the men of his mortal enemy around his family was dangerous. And that's why he got out of it. So the question is, if Esav never really changed his ways, and it was just a temporary thing that he had at that moment, well, why didn't he turn around later and come after Yaakov? After all, Yaakov was still the same, hadn't changed at all, still had the same defenses and whatnot. Esav had all of this manpower with him. So just because he had a temporary change of heart and he decided not to kill him, he could come back the next day, the day after, whatever it is, and finish him off. This is what propelled Rashi to say that Esav actually was unable to do that because his men slipped away and he was left alone, only one man. And as one man, there's no way he could have fought against Yaakov, who had his family with him, his kids. Certainly he had servants, slaves, whatnot. So therefore Esav had no choice but to go back to his place, not having the ability to fight Yaakov at that point. Now these 400 men, for your information, did not do tshuva. They never changed their ways, because if they would have changed their ways, they wouldn't have had to slip away one at a time. They could have said to Esav, "Hey, this is really not for us. We really are not interested in what you're doing, and we're leaving." The fact that they didn't do that means that they still were afraid of Esav. They still saw him as their master, and they just didn't want to participate in this particular endeavor that he was doing. And that's why they didn't make a big deal out of the fact that they were slipping away. Instead, they just slipped away one at a time, because maybe they would join him on his other evil ventures later. They just didn't want to be part of this one. And the reason for that, the Rebbe says, is like we said earlier, they were afraid because there had been a group of angels, like we said, the angels were beating them, and they only let them go because of the merit of Yaakov. And they realized that Yaakov had power over angels. And therefore, they were simply afraid to start up with Yaakov anymore. And therefore, they left. And Esav was left alone, as we said, and that's why he could not start up with them any further. So Rashi brings the story of the 400 descendants of theirs who were saved, because that story actually is a mirror image of what they did. Because just like in the story of these 400 men, they never really changed their ways. There was no tshuva on their part. They simply did not participate in that battle. It was like a one-off thing. So in a similar way, what happened on that occasion when the 400 men of David were saved, the 400 descendants of Esav were saved from David, these 400 men were wicked men. They were part of the party that had attacked David's camp. They were no tzaddikim. They were not righteous men. They didn't become righteous men at this point either. They simply were saved from that one battle when they could have been killed and they weren't. And even that salvation, by the way, was not a miraculous salvation. They were saved for a reason. Like it says, Arameis Ishnar Asher Rochvu al Hagemalim. These were 400 men who ran away on camels. They had a mode of transportation that David's soldiers did not have, and they therefore were able to get away on these animals who traveled quickly and could travel and didn't have to stop so much for resting. David's men didn't have that kind of transport, so they were able to save themselves. This minimizes the miracle of their salvation, and therefore it further explains that they were not tzaddikim who deserved to be saved because of their righteousness. It was simply a tit for tat payback for what their ancestors had done. An interesting point the Rebbe makes is also about camels. Camels are one of 4 non-kosher animals that are different than other non-kosher animals. Who knows how or why?
Through their cuts.
In reference to their
But don't have a split hoof.
biology or something very more specific?
Their biology. I overheard somebody saying about them chewing their cuds.
But don't have a split hoof.
Exactly. They chew their cuds and they don't have a split hoof. And in that respect, they are like the hare and like the hyrax. And then there's one animal that has split hooves but does not chew its cud. Which one is that?
That split hooves and doesn't chew its cud is the pig.
The pig, exactly. So the camel is a mixed breed in terms of it being half kosher. There's really no such thing as half kosher. It's either kosher or not kosher. But
Also the camel has another thing that differentiates it.
yep.
It has a split hoof, but it's not split all the way through.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's interesting. I didn't know that. Okay, yeah, but to be kosher, it has to be split all the way through.
Right, but none of the other animals have no split hoof. But they have a split hoof, but it's not split hoof. None
Right.
of the
Well, the
other animals.
hyrax of the hare don't even have a hoof. They
Right.
just have feet. But yeah, but that's an interesting point. So this goes in well with what we're saying about these men who were saved because of one positive quality in their ancestry, even though they themselves were not particularly righteous men, and the fact that they were saved by these half kosher animals, again, not really half kosher, but these animals that present as if they're kosher, but they're not really, is similar to them having some merit, but not really being righteous after all. We do find a similar occurrence a few parshias ago, where a person can be paid back by something that is given to their descendants many generations later, even if they did not do such a tremendously righteous deed, but they did something good. Hashem does not overlook anything a person does. Even the smallest thing Hashem will repay, whether sooner or later. Eventually Hashem repays. So if we go back to the Torah portion of Vayera, Lot's daughters had babies with Lot. They thought that the world was coming to an end, and that if they didn't have children, that would be the end of mankind. They got their father drunk, and they had relations with him in the cave, one at a time, one each night, I should say, and they got pregnant. And the first one called the child Moav, which means from my father. And the second one called the child Ammon, which is like a member of my nation. The first one was really very forward in the fact that her child was a bastard. Like, this child is from my father. That was like no shame at all. Now, the truth is that she is to be excused for having had relations with the father because she thought she was saving humanity. But the fact that she wasn't embarrassed about it and she put it in his name, that shows there's like a problem here. Whereas the younger daughter, she alluded to it by saying Ammon, from my nation, but she was more modest and she didn't, put the full story into his name. And Rashi says that many generations later, when the Jewish people were entering the land of Israel, they were told not to conquer Moab, but not even to start up with Ammon. That means Moab they were not allowed to conquer because that was not part of the land of Israel, but they were allowed to start little border skirmishes and make trouble for them. But Ammon they were supposed to not touch at all, completely leave them alone. And Rashi says that this is a repayment for the fact that their ancestor, daughter of Lot, was more modest in talking about what happened between her and her father. So we see a similar thing that even when a person does something that's kind of a little bit of a mitzvah, I mean, not really a big mitzvah, but she did something good, Hashem doesn't forget it, and he pays it back, if not right away, several generations later. The same thing is what we see with these 400 men. The Lubavitcher Rebbe now connects this to the Hasidic holiday known as Yud Tes Kislev. the 19th day of Kislev. Who knows what is special about the 19th day of Kislev?
Of Hasidut.
Exactly. It's considered the Rosh Hashanah for Hasidut. And that's because on that day, the author of the Tanya, who is called the Alter Rebbe in Chabad terminology, the old rabbi, was freed from Tsarist imprisonment because there were people who were not happy about his path in Judaism. They told the Tsar on him. The Tsar had him imprisoned. He was imprisoned for 53 days. And then he was exonerated and let free on the 19th of Kislev. And that day became known as the Rosh Hashanah for Hasidut, the holiday, the beginning of the year for Hasidut, because that day is associated with the teachings of the Alter Rebbe that now, so to speak, got the stamp that, so to speak, God was giving his stamp of approval to this movement. It was a bit of a controversial movement. The whole Hasidic movement was controversial, starting with the Baal Shem Tov, who had many opponents. But the Alter Rebbe, the author of the Tanya, who was teaching the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov in a much more expanded way and explaining it in a very intellectual way. So there were questions if this path was really what was appropriate and acceptable. And when he was put in prison, that seemed like maybe his path was not really what Hashem wanted, and that's why he was, he was arranged to be in prison. The fact that he got out, however, that is seen or was seen as a stamp of approval, of heavenly approval, and he started to teach his teachings even more so than he was teaching them previously. So the story of the 19th of Kislev is considered to be like a similar story to what we have here in this parsha. Very often the parsha of the week has parallels with the holidays of the time. I'll give you an example. In this week's parsha, Yaakov goes back across the river to get something he forgot. And that's when the angel comes and fights with him. Who knows what he forgot?
2 small bottles.
What was in those bottles?
I don't think there was anything.
Well, there is a medrash that says that that bottle was the bottle of oil with which he anointed the monument on his way to Haran. When he stopped at Mount Moriah and he slept the night and he had the wonderful dream with the ladder, the next morning it says he poured oil on the monument. And he promised God, if you give me this and that and the other, I'll give you a tithe and I'll worship you and so on. That bottle of oil, where did he get oil from? Rashi says that when he ran away from Esav sent his oldest son Eliphaz to kill him. And Yaakov begged for his life and said, why don't you just take my money and I'll be poor, and a poor person is like he's dead, and then you could leave me alone and you'll fulfill your father's request and I'll still be alive. So he gave him everything. He was left with nothing. How did he even have a bottle of oil? According to the Medrash, it was a miraculous bottle that was placed there by divine intervention. And it was a miraculous bottle that when he poured it, it automatically filled up. It filled itself up. That's the bottle he went back to get, according to the Medrash. That's the same bottle that pops up again in Tanakh when Elijah the prophet was in a drought. And he asked a woman to take him in and feed him. And she said, all I have is a bit of flour and a bit of oil. And he said, don't worry, make me a little cake with what you have, and you'll see the jug of oil will never finish, and the flour will never finish for as long as there's a famine. And that's what happened. The jug of oil pops up again in the next generation when the widow of Ovadia has no money to pay back Ovadia's debts. And she says to the prophet, they're taking my children as slaves to pay my debts. What should I do? He says, what do you have? She says, I have some oil. He says, no problem. Borrow bowls and jugs from your neighbors and start pouring. And she poured and poured and poured until everything was full, and then it stopped. That was the same miraculous jug. When's the next time the jug appears?
Hanukkah.
Thank you very much. That was the jug that was sealed by the seal of the Kohen Gadol, which they found when they were searching the Beis Hamikdash, and that's the miraculous bottle that produced the oil for all 8 days, because it had that powerful, miraculous power. So there's always a connection between the parsha and the coming Yom Tov. Sometimes it's more clear, sometimes less clear. But here we have another connection with the parsha and Yutas Kislev, which actually coincides with Shabbos. So we're going to read the parsha on Shabbos, where we have a similar idea that the enemies of the Alter Rebbe who really wanted him imprisoned, they would have liked if had worse happened to him, God forbid. But they remained his enemies. They never really changed their stripes. But nevertheless, God helped, and they decided to let him out, and he was let out, and he became successful, even more successful than he was before. So that miracle mirrors what happened here, where Esav remained an enemy, the 400 men remained enemies, and nevertheless Hashem helped, and Yaakov and his family were able to escape and not be harmed. Once again, I've been talking for a long time. Questions, comments, ideas, stories to share.
I thought Yaakov had his staff when he crossed.
Exactly. That's Rashi. That's exactly where Rashi says it. Ki v'makli avarti sayarden hazeh. All I had was my staff, nothing else, because Esav had stripped him of all his belongings. The staff was just a piece of wood; it was nothing in particular. So not Esav, sorry, Eliphaz. So he had no need to take it from him. By the way, that's also why he was crying when he met Rachel. When he met Rachel, he kissed her and he cried. Rashi says he was crying because his father's servant Eliezer brought so many gifts when he came to marry his mother, or to find his mother as a wife for his father. And here he was coming with nothing. And Rashi explains why he had nothing was because of this event, how Eliphaz had taken everything from him. Eliphaz, by the way, was an enigmatic character. Just as a side point, going off because we still have 2 minutes to go. Eliphaz was an enigmatic character, by the way, because on the one hand, he did not kill Yaakov, even though his father wanted him to, and that's because he grew up on the knees of Yitzchok. Esav was busy making trouble, and he left his son to be brought up by his parents. So he really grew up in the company of righteous people, and he ended up being somewhat of a righteous man. And he did not kill Yaakov. Yaakov was able to prevail on him not to kill him. In fact, He is also one of the friends of Job. In the book of Job, or Eov, he's one of the three friends that comes to comfort Eov, and he speaks with great wisdom. So on the one hand, he was a pretty righteous man. On the other hand, if you read Rashi at the end of the Torah portion, where it talks about the family of Esav, you see he was getting up to a lot of no good. He had relations with his father's wife and produced a baby. He had relations with one of the wives of one of the princes of Seir and had a baby. He ended up marrying that baby. So it's a bit of an interesting character. Yes, Susan, go ahead.
I can't find the chat because I was going to say, let us all pray for divine intervention for this current situation.
We definitely need to pray, and hopefully Hashem will answer our prayers, that we should completely crush the enemy and leave no enemies. Leave no enemies alive.
Rabbi.
Not all the
Rabbi?
Palestinians are our enemies, but the ones that are, we should completely crush them.
Rabbi?
Yes. Yes.
I wanted to ask you, the staff that you're talking about, didn't the patriarchs have special stories told on these staffs that they carried in order to carry those stories priorly that were brought up to the point of their existence? I mean,
Yeah, it
this is
could
what-
be that was that same staff that came down from Adam and ended up being in Yosef's possession, ended up being in Yisro's
what were
possession.
they? What kind of language was written on these staffs?
There's a lot of
picture
stories for that staff.
pictograms or
A lot of stories go with that staff. We'll have to save that for another class, though. I have to go. Have a wonderful afternoon, everybody, and a good
Bye-bye.
Shabbos after
Thanks,
that.
Have a
Rabbi.
Shabbos.
Rabbi.
Bye, Guzman. Have a good
Yes.
Shabbos.
Thank
Stay
you.
safe.
Rabbi,
Thank you. Yes.
do you have a minute?
Not really.
Oh,
I'm sorry. I have somebody else at 4.
Okay.
Lately, I've been going from one class to another. Forgive me.
okay.
I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Have a good
Thank
one.
you,
Thank you.
Rabbi.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Okay, bye.